Member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak on Bill C-217, an act to amend the Criminal Code on mischief relating to war memorials. Now, over the past several years, we all know that we've seen deplorable incidents across the country where war memorials have been vandalized. And this concludes, Mr. Speaker, a war monument at the front of Malvern Collegiate, just outside of my riding of Toronto-Danforth, which was vandalized just a few nights after it had been newly restored and rededicated. My colleagues and I, of course, strongly condemn these and other disrespectful actions towards war memorials and monuments. That's common ground. We acknowledge and appreciate the hard work of communities and people in communities throughout Canada who have ensured that those who served and sacrificed on behalf of all of us, of all Canadians, are honoured and that their memory is preserved. This memory on our part of those who fought to maintain the memory of others comes at no more appropriate time, Mr. Speaker, than in a week or two before Remembrance Day. Now, personally, for me, honouring military service is very close to my heart. For many years, I've worn the ring that is on this finger that my grandfather, a soldier in the Nova Scotia Highlanders War, when he fell in September 1918 at the Battle of Drocourt-Quéant. He lost his leg that day, and like for so many who cheat death in battle, pain and trauma made post-war survival its own sort of battle. And eventually, in fact, my grandfather succumbed to the effects of his wounds. Thank goodness, at least thank goodness for me, Mr. Speaker, my mother was born before my grandfather passed away. And what makes this connection particularly interesting is that she spent the last 15 to 20 years of her working career working for a monument company, a company that specialized not only in cemetery memorials, but also in larger memorials. Most of the war memorials in Atlantic Canada were produced by the company my mother worked for in Windsor, Nova Scotia, including, for example, the World War II Pilots Memorial in Gander, Newfoundland. Also, a memorial replacing an older memorial in a town in Belgium, commemorating the 85th Battalion of the Nova Scotia Highlanders in their role in the Battle of Passchendaele. So, Mr. Speaker, my purpose in referencing my family history is to suggest that I don't come to this debate not appreciating the importance and the value in our society and for our collective memory of memorials. Now, Bill C-217 proposes to amend Section 430 of the Criminal Code, which is the section dealing with mischief, so as to provide for minimum mandatory fines of $1,000 for a first offence, 14 days in jail for a second, and 30 days in jail for a third, when the mischief is in relation to a war memorial or like structure, similar building, or a part of such a building or structure. However, Mr. Speaker, the current provisions of Section 430 of the Criminal Code already deal with mischief related to the destruction and defacing of property, including war memorials and monuments. And the penalty provisions in the existing Section 430 have provided the courts with an adequate scope for appropriate sentencing without the need for any mandatory minimums. No evidence was presented to the committee at all to suggest a need for mandatory minimums. Section 430 of the Code provides for greater maximum penalties for mischief in relation to churches, synagogues, and so on, but again, there are no minimum sentences. Now, in contrast to the current approach in the Criminal Code, Bill C-217 proposes adding a subsection to deal specifically with mischief relating to war memorials. Like the sponsor of this bill, and again want to emphasize this, I believe we do have an obligation to protect these sacred spaces in our communities in order to honour the Canadians who have made the ultimate sacrifice to our country. As we heard from the sponsor of the bill, the intent of the bill is, and I quote that sponsor, "Send a strong message that vandalism and desecration of our war memorials and cenotaphs will not be tolerated." End of quotation. Be assured that we support this intent in the NDP. However, the means by which the bill proposes to do this, to send this message, is not the right way. As legislators, we must ask whether the imposition of greater mandatory penalties will achieve the purpose of encouraging respect for war memorials, and mandatory minimums simply do not accomplish that end. They do not accommodate the reality of divergent circumstances that judges are called upon to assess, and that can lead them to the conclusion that something less than a mandatory minimum is appropriate, or can lead them to pursue alternative approaches or measures other than fines or jail time. As my colleague from St. John's East, who was acting as the former justice critic, and others have said, we must work hard to find a balance in legislation, and so often mandatory minimums upset that balance. I would also draw to everyone's attention the compelling testimony before the Justice Committee with respect to another bill before this House of the former Supreme Court Justice John Major, who was elevated to the Supreme Court from the Alberta Court of Appeal. I recommend his thoughtful testimony. Just two comments he made are worth mentioning now, just to give you a taste. On one hand, he said, quote, "I'm still a little concerned about a minimum sentence that's absolute. Cases are not all the same, as you know, and the minimum sentence may be inadequate in a number of circumstances, but in other cases, they may not be proper." He went on to say, quote, "It's just the variation in people that pushed me towards the view that a minimum sentence is something I find has a lot of flaws," unquote. And this is a Supreme Court justice who was known for being a very good jurist, but definitely a cautious, if not at times a conservative jurist. And he told the Justice Committee that mandatory minimums are problematic. At work in committee, my colleagues, in particular the Justice critic from St. John's East, proposed a series of amendments to the bill that would have allowed for greater judicial discretion. There's one in particular that I would like to draw attention to, Mr. Speaker, because I think it combines a philosophy, two philosophies that I think can live together with some balance. The NDP would have asked for an amendment that would have read as follows, quote, "A court may delay imposing a punishment on a person convicted of an offence under the subsection in question to enable the person to make reparations for harm done to victims and the community. If the person makes reparations that, in the opinion of the court, are appropriate, the court may impose a punishment that is less than the minimum punishment provided for in that subsection." End of quotation. The government declined to work with us to accept that amendment, but we did hear many testimonies before the committee that suggest that that approach would be recognized as an appropriate one by many in Canada. And I was struck by a letter we received from the Dominion President of the Royal Canadian Legion. And I'm going to read two short passages from that letter, Mr. Speaker. Quote, "Our membership is strongly in favor of recognizing the serious nature of these incidents and in consideration of the feelings and emotions expressed by all Canadians against such acts. We do, however, feel that the provision of appropriate penalties suitable to the individual particulars of an incident should reflect the nature of these acts, and there should be latitude in assessing the gravity of the situation. The punishment should fit the crime, and although no incident of this nature can be condoned, there should be provision for restorative justice measures with a mandated dialogue between veterans groups and the offenders. There should be provision where offenders are encouraged to take responsibility for their actions to repair the harm they have done by apologizing to a group of veterans or with community services. It provides help for the offender to avoid future offences and provides a greater understanding of the consequences of their actions." End of quotation. And I remind those listening that this was the Dominion President of the Royal Canadian Legion. Mr. Speaker, I would much prefer to stand with the Royal Canadian Legion, who have veterans and our historical memory with respect to wartime first and foremost in their minds. I would prefer to stand with their approach than with an approach that relies on mandatory minimums as some kind of salvation for the very serious problem that I again acknowledge of desecration of memorials. And I would end by drawing attention to the case of the Ottawa National War Memorial, where teens charged with urinating on that site ended up working with the Royal Canadian Legion. They were not fined or sent to jail, but they learned, and they are continuing to work with the Royal Canadian Legion in an educational mode. I believe that we should follow the lead of the Legion Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate with